Hey guys, Dr. Joe Rangel, Psych 170, talking about nature versus nurture. Now, by this point, um, you've been exposed to the concept of nature versus nurture quite a bit. And you probably should have gotten it in high school at some point. But here's the thing. There are people on both sides of this argument that are completely sold on one of these two things being the cause for all things. Okay. Um, you know, we talked a while ago about B.F. Skinner and his 100% nurture approach to reality. Um, and then there's people out there that don't believe that your environment has anything at all to do with you, who you are, and it's all genetic. The Nazis, most famously, I think. Um, here's what I mean. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of psychological disorders. There's a whole book of them. We call it the DSM-5, right? And things like post-traumatic stress disorder, which is one of my fields of expertise. It definitely has a nurture component to it. That is an environmental component, right? It has the trauma has to be presented to you. You have to be exposed to a trauma. You absolutely do have a nurture component to post-traumatic stress disorder. However, there may actually be a predisposition in certain people genetically to have a threshold of stress that they can stand before they hit PTSD. And where we see this is we see people from the same unit, the same law enforcement group, the same firefighting team, the same truck, exposed to the exact same incident, and they've had the same training. Admittedly, they haven't had necessarily the same background, right? Because they all come from different places in their life. But one guy or gal can come away from the incident with PTSD, and one may not. And so we ask ourselves, what happened? Why are they different? And so studies are being done right now, and there's research being done to find out if there's a biological component, a threshold of stress to developing PTSD. Of course, this is very hard to do because it could just be based upon these two people's different backgrounds growing up before they ever decided to become firefighters, cops, or soldiers, right? And PTSD isn't limited to people in those types of industries. A civilian can get PTSD from a car crash, or very unfortunately, a sexual assault, or domestic violence, or child abuse, or all sorts of things. So some people come out of it without PTSD. Some people come out of it with PTSD. So what happened? We take a disorder like schizophrenia, which your book talks about. This is a disorder that is just about 100% biological in nature. It's almost 100% nature, right? We don't have a good idea of who's going to be schizophrenic or not. And people can grow up in the most nurturing, loving homes with all sorts of opportunities available to them, very bright, very well educated, and all of a sudden in their 20s, bam, psychotic break. Schizophrenic break. It actually happened to a very good friend of mine when she was 23. Tragic. She was brilliant, and she's still brilliant. But her unfortunately all her dreams of going on into the field she wanted to do were cut short because schizophrenia can be a very debilitating illness. And so we talk about schizophrenia. We measure the hormone and the neurotransmitter levels in people's brains who have schizophrenia, and we determine that they may have excessive levels of dopamine, or the serotonin may be down, or all this may go on. But is that because of the schizophrenia, or did the schizophrenia cause it, or did it cause the schizophrenia? We don't know, but we do know that there does not seem to be that much of a nurture component to something like schizophrenia. Contrast that with something like clinical depression. Now, clinical depression is, I'm not talking about being sad, but I'm talking about actual clinical depression, right, which can be lethal. Clinical depression causes a literal inability to experience joy, happiness. It causes a type of pessimism about life. It causes suicidal thoughts. It causes overwhelming sadness. And I don't mean you just sad and you're sitting in your room and you cry. I mean, we're talking about people who can't get out of bed, can't feed themselves, can't do what they need to do. And a lot of people mask their depression. They're able to function in life, and they're able to do certain things, but it's a facade that they're putting on. And unfortunately, a lot of times when people are putting on this facade, eventually the depression gets to them, and they choose to self-harm or do things to take their own life. A very famous example that I think everyone remembers is Robin Williams, right? He's a funny man, right? And by all accounts had his entire life in order and had everything he could possibly want. Absolute millionaire, favorite of everybody. Nobody disliked Robin Williams. But unfortunately, depression caused him to take his own life. We look at people with depression and we see that they have depleted levels of serotonin in their brain. And a lot of the medications that are given for depression involve either keeping the serotonin from leaking out of the neurotransmitter space or adding serotonin to the space, right? But that's not all. Depression also responds to therapy, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, humanistic therapy, where you're actually sitting down and talking about what's going on in your life and changing the way you're thinking about things. So there you've got an example of something that responds to both nurture and nature. And then on the other end of it, we have things that are almost entirely nurture, right? Things like post-traumatic stress disorder. Like I said, I said we might be a biological component to it, but for now, it is the only requirements of it in the DSM are that you have experienced a life-threatening event, you've seen a loved one experience a life-threatening event, or you've experienced a concurrent amount of traumatic events. Like a firefighter who's gone to a whole bunch of really terrible calls, or a police officer who's gone to a whole bunch of really terrible calls. And the treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder involves using drugs that are very commonly prescribed for depression, like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, those kind of things. Almost always involves a lot of trauma processing and grief processing, a lot of sitting down and talking about it, a lot of getting used to triggers, a lot of being able to handle things that cause fear and trigger that fight or flight response. Okay. So there you've got something with a strong nurture component, right? So when we talk about nature versus nurture, are people a result of their biology or are they a result of their environment? The answer is, frankly, a little bit of both. I said at the beginning of this, people who thought people were completely nature, most notably the Nazis. Let me explain that one to you. When you believe that a person's criminality, immorality, their evilness, or whatever you want to ascribe to it, is due completely to their genetic makeup, that's where racism gets born from. Okay, that's where that kind of stuff comes from. And I think in 2024, most rational people understand that while genetics do have something to do with your potential, if you've got a learning disorder or something like that, it doesn't have a whole hell of a lot to do with your value as a person or your morality, and who you end up becoming and the way you choose to do things has a lot to do with how you're raised and the environment you're in, those sorts of things. So nurture, nature, probably a little bit of both. All right, guys, I'm Dr. Joe Rangel. Thanks for paying attention.